Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to show you how to add dimension to your flat 2D pattern pieces. What I mean by 2D is that this is just a pattern piece for your plushies that is a front and a back. It's not 3D with a gusset in any way, and those pattern pieces can tend to look a little bit flat because they are just two pieces of minky sewn together. What I mean by dimension is that you can see how this wing here is more thick than you would get just by sewing two pieces of minky together, and it also has this top stitch detail in here to define these individual feathers. I use this technique for a variety of pattern pieces, often for wings like shown here, because they can look a little bit flat without any interest or detail in them. And also if I'm just doing individual feather pieces, I've done this to make little hair curls, which I have another tutorial on, which you can see. I've also made tails for like a chameleon that has a little swirl in it, which I'll put a picture up. So there's just a really wide variety of details that you can get using this method. I'll walk through how I do this, and it's pretty easy as well. There are two key things to get your item to have dimension. The first one is to line it with quilt batting. I have a piece here and it is a thicker quilt batting. You can see here just how thick it is. It's about a ½ inch. I've used thinner ones in the past, and you can either get the thin one and double it up as you need to, or you can get this thick one, but you might want to have both. This thick one has a nice weight to it as well that the thin one doesn't have, so it can help give your piece strength as well, which you'll see later on in this video. So I tend to carry both weights of quilt batting just depending on what project I'm working with. Because this wing that I'm making is pretty large, I like to have this thicker one because it does add a nice thickness to it. And if it was smaller, I might want to use the thinner quilt batting, but I'm just going to go with this thick one for this project. Adding the quilt batting as a lining is very simple, so you just want to cut out a piece of quilt batting that is somewhat larger than your pattern piece. So this is my wing pattern piece, and I purposely cut it out larger just so I don't have to worry too much about pinning it exactly right. You will have a little bit more material waste this way because you are going to end up cutting out all this extra at the end, but in the past when I've trimmed the batting to the pattern piece, I find that I'll often run out in certain areas, or it just shifts too much when sewing, and so you won't get it caught in any of the edges, which is one of the advantages of this. Is it will add that structure and strength to your pattern piece when it gets sewn into the edges. This is probably going to be hard to see over a video. When you add the quilt batting to the bottom, depending on what side you have the minky on, whether it's facing this way or facing this way on the batting, it actually changes the way that it lays a bit. So this side is more flat than this side here. It's a bit more rounded on this side of the wing than this side of the wing. So if you're making symmetrical objects like wings, you want to flip the way that you're sewing the wing and placing it on the batting. So when I sewed this wing, I had the pattern piece facing this way on top of the quilt batting. But for this one, I'm going to flip it and have it laying this way on the batting. And of course I need to flip this. But it's just a little subtle thing that happens when you sew the quilt batting onto the back of the minky, that it actually kind of slightly changes how it looks on each side, where you have one flatter side and then you have a rounded side on the opposite end. So I'm just going to pin this piece together as I normally would any pattern piece. I'm not going to pin the quilt batting to the minky because it can distort the way that you pin this piece together. I prefer to pin my piece together as normal and then just place the quilt batting underneath my object when I'm ready to sew it. So now that my piece is pinned together, I'm just going to lay it on top of the quilt batting. And because I cut the batting so much larger than the pattern piece itself, I don't actually attach the quilt batting before sewing it in any way because I just don't find it necessary. So if you're having difficulties, you could try pinning it together, but just be wary of how that is potentially distorting your pattern piece that is pinned on top of it. So I'm going to go ahead and get this to my sewing machine and we're going to sew it together. So there's nothing really special about the way that I'm going to sew this together. I'm just going to do a normal stitch length with a normal back stitch at the front and the end of it. And just of course put the quilt batting on the underneath side, because if you put it on top, you're not going to be able to see what you're doing. And of course I always sew over my pins, and I can't recommend that you do this because it is dangerous, but I am too lazy to take them out. I will take them out though if I see that the fabric is starting to bunch up here like it is here. I'll take this pin out and smooth it down with my fingers and then move on. Okay, so it's all sewn together. You can see the outline in the quilt batting on the other side. So now we can get this trimmed up. So now you want to trim off all the excess batting around the edges as well as trim your seams. So I'm just taking a large pair of scissors and cutting around the piece where I don't need to trim the seam, but if I am going to trim the seam, then I'm going to go ahead and cut into both the minky and the batting. And if you're sewing corners like this, it's really important that you get very close to your stitches to be able to get a nice clean turn on these edges. In areas like this where you have a color transition where it can be hard to see really where your seam is pointing at the end, it's easier if you flip it over to where the stitch marks are on your batting, because then you don't have any excess minky seams kind of distorting what you're seeing. So now I can clearly see where this point is and I can come in and trim closely. Alright, so it's all trimmed up and now we can flip this right side out. I'm going to take my handy wooden spatula to help push out these wingtips. Okay. So it's extra important to check all your edges when doing this, because with the quilt batting on the other side, it's really hard to see if you've caught all your fabric. You can see here that the bottom layer of minky was not caught in my seam, and this happens semi-frequently with this technique just because that bottom layer of minky tends to want to move inward towards the center of the object with that layer of batting underneath it. It doesn't quite stay exactly where it should, so you might end up in this situation a lot where your one layer of minky does not get caught, but luckily it's an easy fix. I'm just going to seam rip this seam area right here and then just make sure that this minky gets caught in the seam on the next attempt. So I'm just going to fix this real quick and then we can move on. Alright, I've got that issue corrected and now it's all flipped right side out. The corners look nice and clean. I don't have any fabric bunching up here where the feathers of the wings form. So now I can move on to the next step. If you didn't want to add any further detail to your piece, you can stop here. You certainly don't have to do any top stitching detail like I'm about to do. But with a wing, it still looks a little plain without any definition from the top stitching. So you can compare my finished wing here and see how I've defined the individual feathers just through some top stitching. And so that's what we're going to do to this piece here. There's a couple different ways you can mark what you want to stitch on. You can use a water-soluble or an air-soluble fabric pen. So this is an air-soluble one here. If you're going to do this top stitching at a later time, say wait to trace on anything with an air-soluble one. Otherwise, if you're going to do it much later, you'll want to use a water-soluble one so it doesn't disappear. But you can just draw on the shape that you want to stitch onto your piece. Just make sure whatever pen you're using, you can actually remove it. Another way I found to do it without using a pen is to actually take a little pin and then just kind of draw on the shape in the minky. And this way you don't have to worry about fabric pen potentially leaving any permanent marks or even having to wash it out. So you can see how easy it is to see your line that you need to draw if you do this, and because the pin moves the pile of the minky, it does stay nicely put. So now we can go ahead and top stitch this. I'm going to use black thread, and the reason for that is just because the wings of my mascot are meant to look very hand sewn and handmade. So I like using the contrasting thread in the wings, but you can definitely use matching thread if you only want to get the dimension but no further color detail. But I will be using black for this project. It is better to do your stitches on the frontward facing side of your object. So with this wing, this is going to be the side that faces us. So I would want to do my top stitching on the front side just so I make sure that it looks exactly right from the front side, rather than doing it on the other side that isn't going to be seen easily. I'm not going to be doing anything fancy with this stitching, just a normal length straight stitch with a back stitch at the beginning and the end, and I'm just going to stitch over the lines that I've lightly traced with a pin. Alright, and we're all done. So now we just need to finish by trimming off the excess threads on the stitch lines that we've done. And you can see on the back here that you'll get some markings from your feed dogs on the bottom of your sewing machine on the wrong side of your object. So you can just use your hand to smooth them out. The minky pile will pick up that shape of the feed dogs and the needle plate underneath it, but it's an easy fix. And we're all done. The wings look a lot nicer than they would if they were just two pieces of plain minky sewn together. Because I used that thick quilt batting, they have a nice structure and a nice strength to them that they wouldn't get otherwise. If I had used the thin one, they wouldn't be so strong as to be able to hold up on their own. So that's another pro of using that thick quilt batting. So hopefully you guys can use this technique for something. It's really useful, and one of my favorite techniques is it really makes things pop just a little bit more to make your plushies a little bit more interesting. So thanks for watching, guys, and see you next time. Bye-bye.